Hello, and welcome to the Population Factor. I'm your host, Phil Cafaro. In recent decades, American environmentalists have argued, sometimes furiously, about whether U.S. immigration rates are too high. One key question dividing them has been what role immigration-driven population growth plays in creating our environmental problems. Several years ago, a colleague and I set out to answer that question by preparing an environmental impact statement on U.S. immigration policy. This 480-page opus was published in 2016 by the group Progressives for Immigration Reform. And today, that colleague, Leon Kalankowicz, joins me to discuss its findings. Leon is a practicing environmental scientist, wildlife biologist, and natural resources planner. He's worked as a consultant on NEPA projects since 1990, managing numerous environmental impact statements on projects including roads, parks, mines, dams and reservoirs, and many more. Leon, welcome to the Population Factor.
Thanks for having me, Phil.
It's great having you here. Great to see you again.
Great to see you.
So let me begin by saying a few words about NEPA, and then maybe you can explain how environmental impact statements fit within it. The U.S. National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, was enacted by Congress in 1969, and it's really the nation's most important environmental law. It requires all federal agencies to give serious consideration to the environmental impact of projects they approve, fund, or carry out. Under NEPA, all federal agencies are required to consider and review the environmental implications of agency actions whenever they, quote, significantly affect the quality of the human environment. NEPA represents a commitment to environmental protection. It establishes a national policy to use all practicable means to, quote, create and maintain conditions under which man and nature can exist in productive harmony for present and future generations of Americans. Among NEPA's primary goals is to achieve, quote, a balance between population and resource use, which will permit high standards of living and a wide sharing of life's amenities. So, okay, Leon, what role do EISs, or environmental impact statements, play in applying this law?
They are considered the action forcing mechanism, Phil. Basically, they require federal agencies to look before they leap. That is, to anticipate and divulge to the public and stakeholders and decision makers what the potential impacts of those actions or projects or programs that they are conceiving or would like to carry out before they actually do them. So instead of leaping, you take that look, that hard look at where you're going and see whether or not you want to get there or go there, or whether or not the environmental impacts entailed with getting there are worth it. So it does not, NEPA does not require any particular outcome, but 50 years ago, the federal government began saying that, look, we want to more carefully look at and anticipate the environmental effects of where we're going. And NEPA itself was very much an outgrowth of growing concern for the environment in the 1950s and in the 1960s, as the nation underwent unparalleled population and economic growth after World War II. In the 1950s, we famously had the baby boom. In the 1960s, that began to taper off a little bit, but was still very substantial. And in both decades, there was, again, unprecedented economic growth, all of which meant that there, as well as technological change, all of which meant that there are new impacts on the environment under the sun that people had never really contemplated before.
So really, these EISs are, they're planning documents, and they're saying when you're planning something that could have an important environmental impact, you need to consider that, justify it to yourselves and to the general public. And part of the process then is asking the general public what they think about these alternatives, the environmental impacts, but also this is an opportunity to talk about other impacts as well.
Exactly. In fact, the human environment is construed very, very broadly. We talk about impacts on biodiversity, impacts related to climate change, impacts related to noise levels and air pollution, water pollution, but also impacts on so-called socioeconomics and environmental justice. What are the impacts on people? What are the impacts on their employment prospects? And that sort of thing. That's what is meant by the human environment. It's both the biophysical environment and the very human environment, the sociological environment, the cultural environment. In fact, cultural resources are one of the major areas studied in environmental impact statements.
So almost since its inception, some environmentalists have argued that the EIS requirement should be applied to US immigration policy. And the argument's been pretty straightforward. Immigration can impact population numbers can impact the environment. To date, however, the relevant government agencies have declined to undertake such a review of immigration policy or of population policy more generally. And that's where we came in with support from Progressives for Immigration Reform and the Whedon Foundation. We performed such an analysis to answer our main question: how do US immigration policy choices impact the environment? So let's talk a little bit now about the EIS that we did 5 years ago. One of the first steps is an alternatives analysis. You have to lay out a number of alternative policy choices that could be made. And the idea is, if you're going to plan, you need to have relevant alternatives in front of you. So you start, of course, with the so-called no action alternative. And that would just be keeping the policy status quo. And we figured out that at that time and continuing to today, the US net immigration, so total immigration into the country minus emigration from the country, legal and illegal, if you add all that together, that was about 1.25 million people annually. So the no action alternative was continuing to bring in a net of 1.25 million people annually. What were the other alternatives that we looked at?
Okay, so the no action alternative, or the status quo, as you say, keeping things the way they are right now and projecting the impacts of those into the future, was 1.25 million. And then we had a so-called expansion alternative, which added 1 million people annually to that. So the expansion alternative then was 2.25 million net per year. And then we had a so-called reduction alternative, which was reducing current levels by 1 million a year down to 250,000 a year, or 0.25 million a year, which are more towards traditional levels of immigration rates in the country that prevailed throughout most of the 20th century.
So that reduction alternative would have taken us back to immigration levels from the 40s, 50s, and the first part of the 60s, let's say. The expansion alternative, conversely, would have increased immigration levels. And we figured that was roughly in line with some of the proposals that had recently been made in Congress to increase immigration. I noticed just the other day in the New York Times, there was a proposal by Jorge Ramos to increase immigration to 2 million annually. So this kind of range of alternatives is sort of a reasonable range in terms of what people have been proposing for policy choices. And by focusing in on those three alternatives, then if you wanted to split the difference between two of them, let's say, you could have a sense of what that would be.
Right. And that's that term reasonable that you used, Phil, is very much a term of art in NEPA. You try and pick alternatives that do represent this reasonable range or range of reasonable alternatives. And the three that we have bracketed where we are right now, and we had an alternative, the reduction alternative, that looked at more traditional rates of immigration. And then we had the expansion one, looking at levels that are very much in line with some of the proposals we were seeing some years back when we did this and currently?
So the next step after we chose those alternatives was to do population projections. So the next question becomes then, how will overall population be impacted by immigration levels at these three different levels? And we projected out from the 2010 US Census numbers all the way out to the 2100 US Census numbers. Give listeners a sense of what we found there.
Well, the further you project out, of course, the wider the disparity or the gulf between the alternatives becomes. And we felt that it was important to do that because from one year to the next, you really don't notice these changes. Adding another 1 million people a year is less than 1% of the existing population. That's within sort of what we would call in the environmental sciences, the noise ratio, right? You really can't discern or tease out different impacts from 1/3 of a percent additional number of people. But if you go far enough out, and all of us hope and expect the country to be here in the year 2100, a lot of us will have descendants who are still alive then. I hope my own children are, for example.
Sure.
80 years from now, or 79 from 2021, is not all that far off. So if you project out to 2100 at the 1.25 million, what we call the no action alternative, would go from 309 million in the year 2010 out to, I think it was 524 million. So adding, what was it? Well over 200 million more people, right? I think it was a 70% increase in population size.
70% increase, that's right. So, simply sticking with our current immigration policies would lead to a 70% increase in the U.S. population by 2100. Exactly. Then we looked at our other two alternatives. Under the expansion alternative, bringing in another 1 million people annually, that would result in a population of 670 million people by 2100. That's an increase of 360 million from above the 2010 population, an increase of 117%. So it gives you a little bit of
doubling, in other words.
It would be more than a doubling, and it gives you a sense of how relatively small annual changes can accumulate over time.
Right.
Conversely, under the reduction alternative, that would lead, we calculated, to a population of 380 million in 2100, which would have been an increase of 70 million or 23% over the 2010 population. Right. And for listeners, you should know that right now we're right around 330 million in the United States today. So again, even with that relatively small annual decrease in immigration, you can see that we wouldn't have a smaller population in 2100. We'd still have more people than we have today, but we wouldn't have nearly as large an increase.
Right.
So if you put all that together, what you're saying is these relatively small annual changes in the numbers make the difference between stabilizing our population about 20-25% above what it is today to more than doubling our population by 2100.
Phil, one of the key realities or findings of our study, or any demographic projection like that, is that in the year 2100, in spite of those enormous increases in our numbers, under both the no action alternative, 1.25 million annually, and the expansion alternative, 2.25 million annually, we would still be growing very, very fast in the year 2100. We would not be approaching stabilization under either of those two alternatives or demographic scenarios.
So that's kind of key. We're going to be, as part of this, we're showing these population projections on your screen. And of course, as Leon says, we hope the world won't end in 2100. We hope it'll continue on. So as you're looking at those three population projections, put a little arrow on the end of it. And just imagine that all else being equal, those trajectories will continue. So sticking with the status quo or expanding immigration doesn't just mean we're going to have more people in 80 years. It also means that we'll continue to have more people in the future. In other words, at some point, if you want to stabilize a population, you're probably going to have to cut back on immigration. Now, as we discuss in the EIS, there are other ways to cut back on total population. You can try to decrease the fertility rate, and changes in fertility rate will also make a difference to future US populations. You can increase or decrease the mortality rate. And of course, we don't want to get to a stable or lower population by increasing the death rate. That's
right.
that's not the way
That's
we want to do it. So, okay, we've got our three population trajectories, our projections. Then the next step in the EIS is to ask, how important are more or fewer people in terms of environmental impact? And EIS is only as good as its ability to quantify these kinds of questions. Now, for our analysis, we had 6 areas that we looked at: urban sprawl and farmland loss, water use and withdrawals from rivers, greenhouse gas emissions and resultant climate change, habitat loss and impacts on biodiversity, energy demands and national security implications, and then the international ecological impacts of US immigration policies. So we only have a certain amount of time here, but let's consider several of these areas. If you look at urban sprawl and farmland loss, what did we find for that?
Well, we found that if you add those numbers of people, certainly under the higher of the two alternatives, the no action and the expansion alternative, there would be tens of millions of acres of both natural habitat and farmland or agricultural land that would be sprawled over. When you add 20 to 30 million people a decade in and decade out, they all need places to live. They need places to work. They need transportation areas. All of that takes up land. And on the average in recent decades, it's been roughly 1/3 of an acre per person. Now, in the last 2 decades, that has come down somewhat. But and one thing that it's important to realize, Phil, is that the amount of land that each person is using is far more than just the residence that they're on. Some folks think that just by building up, right, stacking people one on top of one another, going up instead of going out, as it's sometimes put, that they are saving all of this additional land that their presence imposes on the biosphere. And to some extent that is true, but again, there are all sorts of other urban land uses that support each additional consumer. And as I say, on the average, it's roughly 1/3 of an acre per person. So if you're adding 200 million more people, that is an enormous 70 to 80 million acre addition of the amount of urbanized or developed land that it's going to take to support that additional population. And all of that land has to come from either natural habitat or farmland or both.
So, when you think about this, when our listeners think about this, you got to imagine people need places to live. You need a home or a house or an apartment. But we also use roads. We also have to eat food. And so each one of us is trailing a little bit of agricultural land that is being used to feed us. We like to recreate. We take up space doing that. So these are all the various things that now, as Leon says, you can decrease those impacts with greater efficiency in various ways, but there are limits to that. And all else being equal, more people means more impact. So one of the things we calculated, and this is kind of interesting, is acres of cropland per person under these different scenarios. So in 2010, in the United States, there was 1.2 acre of cropland for every person in the country. By 2100, just under the status quo immigration scenario, we're instead looking at only 0.3 acres of farmland. Now, why might this be? Well, it's because each person you're adding sort of comes at this and decreases it in two ways. More people means more sprawl, and that paves over agriculture land. On the other hand, each person you add means one more person who needs agriculture land to be fed. So if you add those two impacts together, you've got about a quarter of the cropland per person in 2100 as you would have had just keeping the population stable from 2010.
Exactly. And that's so it turns out, and maybe this isn't a surprise to a lot of folks, that the best land to build on is the best land to grow on, right? That is, grow crops on, to grow food on. Flat land with access to water attracts both builders and farmers. And so you have that competition for the same high quality land. And so folks, each additional food consumer in this case, again, is putting an additional load on our agricultural land base, both by needing food and by needing a place to live, right? So another way of doing that, one thing we tried to do in this document was not accept that per capita impacts were always going to be the same, both I think with regard to our farmland and natural habitats and wildlife impacts. We assumed that we could reduce the per capita impact of each person by up to maybe 30%, just to throw some numbers out, or that as a result of increasing income and consumption, higher per capita impacts, each person might have up to 1.5 times the impact. So we allowed for a range of impacts there. But the reality is that adding new consumers means that you're devouring greater portions of the earth and biodiversity and an aggregate ecological footprint to support that higher population.
So that's an important point to make. We really did try to leave open the possibility that Americans will make some strides in being more efficient and decreasing their per capita resource use.
Exactly.
But what we found, and this is something that people have seen in recent decades as well, if you have a relatively fast growing population, you have to run very fast just to stay in place. So over the past 40 years, to give an example, California has improved its water efficiency use quite a bit. Californians use on average about half the amount of water per capita that they did 40 years ago. But P.S., there's twice as many people in California than there were 40 years ago. So there's no more water available for other species, for instance, or to leave in rivers after all that work on increased efficiency.
And that's an important point, because it is, as a conservationist, I very much believe in trying to reduce my own per capita ecological footprint or environmental impact. And there are many ways each of us can do that, and urge government to set standards that require everyone in the private sector and industry to do that. But by forever increasing the numbers of consumers and carbon emitters and water users, you offset those gains that you get from increased efficiency and conservation, offset or overcome them, nullify them. I've worked on environmental impact statements on both electricity, that is electrical power production, and dams and reservoirs to provide water for municipal growth. And in both cases, increased energy efficiency and increased water use efficiency was more than offset by the projected increase in population, which meant that environmentally damaging projects had to go forward if you're going to meet that net rise in aggregate demand or aggregate consumption of resources.
As someone who's done a lot of these EISs, then you're very familiar with the fact that early in the process, you have to go to the US Census Bureau and take a look at what the population projections are for the region that is designated to be served by these projects.
That's right.
And, a lot of times the decisions come down to, do we really need this or not? The answer to that could be very different whether, you've got the same population in 50 years or twice as many people.
That's right. You know, it's interesting and kind of ironic. Population is cited as a major accelerant of damage to the environment in the NEPA statute itself. I think it's in section 1 or section 101, where it refers to the profound impacts of population growth on the environment. And in a lot of the NEPA documents that are prepared around the country that have been written and published and evaluated for half a century now, population is always in there as one of the main drivers, and perhaps the main driver in the so-called purpose and need for a given proposed action or project. But that doesn't mean that stopping population growth is considered to be one of the options, right? Because it's always given as an underlying factor, something that can't be changed.
And that's what we were trying to get around by doing an EIS specifically on immigration policy, which is the main driver of current and projected US population growth. Let's take a look at another one of our 6 areas of environmental impact, habitat loss and impacts on biodiversity. Again, what were the findings there of this EIS?
Well, the findings there, I don't remember the specific numbers that we came up with at this point, but the findings there that were that as a result of this increasing demand for both land to provide for additional people and the increasing energy needs, water needs, the impact on biodiversity would be profound. I think we found it to be significantly adverse, highly significantly adverse, projected out to the year 2100. Again, from one year to the next, Phil, you don't see all that much change from an additional million people or even an additional 3 million people at a population of 330 million. But the cumulative impacts over time are nothing short of extraordinary. Adding 200 million additional people in this fixed land area, adding 300 million additional people at a time when wildlife biologists such as myself know that the main driver of the biodiversity crisis, the extinction crisis, is loss of habitat, fragmentation of habitat. We have other things such as poaching, pollution or contamination, invasive species, all of which are also more indirectly related to the number of humans weighing on the landscape, but it's habitat loss, which is the main driver of our biodiversity and extinction crises in this country and in the world. And so adding 70 million at the lowest of the 3 alternatives up to more than 300 million in the expansion alternative would have a profoundly adverse cumulative effect on wildlife habitat, wildlife populations, and biodiversity more generally.
So as you say, conservation biologists are in agreement that habitat loss, habitat degradation is the key driver of biodiversity loss.
Right.
Adding more people simply makes it more likely that that number will increase. The more
Exactly.
people you add, the quicker that habitat loss and degradation will happen. And as you say, if you're concerned about pollution, which is another secondary cause of biodiversity loss, if you're concerned with overhunting, overgathering, overexploitation, all of these things tend to be accelerated by adding more people. And conversely, we should add, in places where those populations are decreasing, that tends to open up opportunities for rewilding and ecological restoration.
Exactly.
So if you go around to parts of the northeastern United States where you have a stable or decreasing population, if you go to the major rewilding efforts in Europe, you often see that it's former agricultural land that's no longer needed because their populations are stable or declining. So we want to remind people of that as well. It's just not the case that population always has to go up, or even that the only alternative is to stabilize it. We might have fewer people.
You know, we actually have in this country, say, since the year 1900, our population, the U.S. population, I believe, grew by 4 times in the 20th century, and from 75 million to 200 million plus. And yet during that same time period, as a result of technological change and social change, perhaps a quarter to a third of the counties in the country actually underwent population loss. And those were the places that you found habitat being restored on, say, former farmlands in the Southern Appalachians or in the New England states. And a lot of wildlife habitat, national wildlife refuges, et cetera, were developed on those areas that had stable or declining populations. So it does open up the potential for being able to restore the habitats and the wildlife that depend on them.
So just as if we're talking about water use or energy use or anything else, we can imagine a range of alternatives where per capita use either goes up or down. When we looked at habitat loss and biodiversity preservation, we also looked at that very same thing, and we imagined per capita use of biodiversity or degradation of biodiversity anywhere from 0.7 to 1.3 what it is today.
Right.
And then we plug those figures in to the population changes. And so what we found, just to quote a few more figures from the study, under the no action alternative, where we're growing by about 200 million people from today, the net aggregate effect on habitats and biodiversity would range from approximately 1.2 to 2.2 times greater than it is today. So if we continue with that population growth, even if we improve our efficiency and decrease our personal footprints on wildlife, we're still looking at putting more demands and having less wildlife.
Exactly.
Conversely, if you went with the immigration reduction alternative, the net aggregate effect on habitats and biodiversity would range from 0.8 what it is today to 1.6 times what it is today. So
Right.
Under that alternative, you actually open up a space where we could be taking less and leaving more for other species.
Exactly. And
again, it's just, oh, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I think that we would agree that that's all part of a strong sustainability, right? Thinking of the biosphere and planet Earth as being here not just to meet human needs, but to provide for ecological and biodiversity for the other species that are our fellow citizens on this planet, as it were.
Yeah, that's an important point, and it's something for our listeners to really consider. As you think about these questions, we really have two ways to think about them. We can ask ourselves, well, how many people can we sustain in the United States or on planet Earth, or in Colorado or in Pennsylvania where you are? And we can determine that and act on that basis and act as if really everything is available for us, and we won't really worry too much about other species. Or we can ask, how many people can we have on this planet, in the United States, et cetera, and still continue to have robust populations of wildlife? And the answers to those two questions might be very different.
Considerably different. And again, it's impossible to quantify that, but from the strong sustainability perspective, the key question is not how many people the United States or the Earth can contain, but how many we can sustain. And from the broader biodiversity perspective, the more space or the fewer of us there are, and the lower our aggregate consumption, the more space and resources there are for the other critters that share this space in this universe with us. Some of the viewers may have seen these amazing and depressing statistics in recent years to the effect that over 95% of the standing biomass of vertebrates or mammals on the planet, or certainly the terrestrial portions of the planet, are human beings, Homo sapiens, and the handful of domesticated animals that we have. And only 5% of the total living weight are all of the other mammals, 5,000, 7,000 mammals that make up the Earth. That's how little we have left right now for the rest of creation, to say nothing of adding hundreds of millions of more of us in this country and billions more on the planet.
If you go back to NEPA, NEPA talks about the desire to have a state of harmony between human beings and nature, the rest of the natural world, other species. You really can't seriously talk about a state of harmony if you're just crowding everything else out. You know, it doesn't work that way.
That's right, and I think those values and concerns were implicit in the intent of the legislators who enacted NEPA in 1969.
Let's talk a little bit about water demands and withdrawals from natural systems, withdrawals from rivers, lakes, aquifers. That's an issue that's of particular interest to those of us living in the Western US. What did we find in the analysis regarding water and water use?
Once again, we assumed there that, in fact, I believe we extrapolated from recent reductions in per capita use of water and went an additional 25% below where we are right now in terms of per capita demands on water, up to, no, I don't think we even, I think we assumed that overall there would be that decrease in per capita water consumption. But
That's
even
right.
there, yeah, as I mentioned earlier, the population growth under certainly the no action alternative and the expansion alternative more than offset those gains or drops in per capita consumption and increased our aggregate demand on water. Now, as a result of climate change and the projections that there is going to be a lot less water available in this century in the American Southwest in particular from climate change, it's unclear whether or not those demands can even be met without more exotic means of supplying water, like what do you call it, desalination from the ocean using reverse osmosis or some other technology not yet developed. But one thing to consider there is that's not a silver bullet or a panacea. Those have impacts. It takes a lot
Absolutely.
to produce that water, and where are you going to get the energy from?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking to try to decrease our carbon emissions, and one good way to do that is to decrease our energy use. But if you start to say Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle start to have to get their water from desalination,
right,
that's putting a pretty big energy bite on things.
You know, the reality is that we're using water, and especially again in the Southwest, at unsustainable rates right now. You have a number of aquifers that are in permanent decline, where although water itself is a renewable resource, right? We have the hydrologic cycle that is a representation of that renewability of water. But a lot of the stocks of water in the West, like the Ogallala Aquifer, for example, that extends up into Colorado, and I think through 13 Western states, that is being mined. That water isn't even being used because, that isn't being replenished at a rate that is anywhere near its use. It's being used at a highly unsustainable rate right now. The Colorado River, as a lot of people famously know, is been used up, tapped out to the point where it never reaches the Sea of Cortez down in Mexico anymore. As a result of this drying climate and this perhaps mega drought that we're in right now, Lake Powell, upstream of the Grand Canyon, Lake Mead, downstream of the Grand Canyon, have infamous bathtub rings around them because the water level has dropped so substantially. So water is a very, very serious issue in the Southwest at the same time that population is growing there by leaps and bounds.
So we're concerned about that because, we're concerned about the well-being of our human communities. Even if you take an optimistic view and say, well, we can get even more efficient than 25%, et cetera. A worry that a lot of us have is that we'll find a way to take care of human needs, but that'll come at the expense of non-human beings. And again, just to throw out a few figures from from the environmental impact study, under the no action immigration alternative, under the status quo, even with good conservation measures, we're still looking at a 25% increase in the demand on water resources between 2010 and 2100. Right. And if you go with the immigration expansion alternative, you're looking instead at an increase in nationwide water demand of 62% by 2100. Again, within a context of climate change, overuse of aquifers, things which might wind up decreasing the water that we have available. Right. So again, whether you're more of a human-centered, anthropocentric kind of person, or whether you're more of a wildlife lover like Leon and I, these are issues that make a difference. So,
right. And again, by conserving water, we want to not only sustain it for human use, but be able to return water to the natural aquatic habitats from which we have withdrawn it, right? A lot of the biodiversity damage especially the Southwest, once again, is from taking water away from those aquatic systems. A lot of the threatened species are aquatic species. That's actually true in the Southeast as well, where dams and pollution and channelization have heavily impacted mussels. North America, I should say, is the world's hotspot for mussel biodiversity. It is one of the forms of taxa that they're important, aquatic macroinvertebrates. And so we want to be able to return water and restore ecosystems that have already been affected by human use. And by increasing human demands, it makes it harder, if not impossible, to do that.
So, very important point. I mean, we've seen some pretty inspiring projects in various parts of the country, up in New England, up in the Pacific Northwest, where we've taken out small to medium-sized dams on the Elwha River in Washington, for instance. And we've really seen that you can restore some of these things. You can restore salmon runs. You can make better mussel habitat in the southeastern United States. But there's a conflict. You can't keep accelerating and accommodating human demands and still hope to do that good ecological restoration work.
Exactly. And again, this comes from living on a finite planet, right? And having to make tough choices. That is the reality of our ecological condition and ecological imperative, is that we have to make tough choices, and that you can't have unlimited growth on a finite planet. It's a condition that just won't be carried on for all that long.
So, Leon, we've talked about the impacts of more people or fewer people in a number of key environmental areas. How would you summarize the overall findings of this EIS?
Well, the overall findings, Phil, are that projected to the year 2100, there are tremendously different cumulative impacts from the choices that we make today on immigration policy, specifically with regard to the number of people that settle in the country. The expansion alternative, adding 2.25 million additional people every year to the US population and carried out 79 years to the year 2100, would lead to hundreds of millions of additional American residents, right? Each of which is a consumer of resources and an emitter of wastes, everything from waste into water to carbon dioxide. The reduction alternative to bring levels of immigration back to more traditional ones, not to shut the door, not to stop or to cease immigration, but to return it to more traditional levels, would allow us the chance to pursue environmental sustainability in a way that is much more realistic than either the no action alternative, keeping those rates where they are today, or certainly the expansion alternative. And this has been recognized in a number of efforts over the years. Some of the listeners or viewers may be familiar with President Clinton's Council on Sustainable Development, developed after the Earth Summit in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. There was a population and consumption task force in that as part of that Council on Sustainable Development. And in 1996, a quarter of a century ago, they issued their findings that although they recognized immigration was a very sensitive issue and had to be treated sensitively, reducing immigration levels was a very important part of pursuing population stabilization in the United States, an indispensable part of it, in fact, and the pursuit or the drive towards sustainability. So this has been recognized by environmental scientists and policy people a lot over the years. That is, we can't have population growth in this country from now until kingdom come and not expect there to be consequences.
So as you say, I think the scientists tend to realize this. When you actually start to crunch the numbers and ask hard questions about environmental impacts, the answers seem to come back pretty clearly that fewer people can help create a sustainable society, or even more strongly put, are necessary for creating a sustainable society. Right. Now, I might have you back for another show at some point, and we could talk about the reasons for why these questions and issues have been pushed under the rug. But instead, now I'm going to ask for my last question. Do you see a change in the last few years? Do you see people more willing to talk about the connection between population and the environment?
Yes and no, Phil. It's I see both encouraging and discouraging signs. I think both nationally and internationally, there is an underground and growing awareness that numbers have to be taken into account. At the same time, there's pushback on that and all sorts of, I would say, scurrilous accusations against those of us who insist on making an issue of population size and what we can do to cease population growth.
So that is true. I mean, you can be called some pretty choice names if you bring up these issues. On the other hand, we're starting to see things like the World Scientists' Warning on Climate Change, 2017, yes, signed by over 12,000 scientists around the world. And it said very clearly, population growth is one of the main drivers of climate change, and stabilizing populations at a sustainable level is going to be part of the solution. Exactly. Needs to be part of the solution. So I look at that and go ahead.
I'm one of the signers of that, and I'm very proud of it. And yes, they made population growth and the need to stabilize numbers one of the key elements in their framing of this issue. So I was very happy to see that.
So it's possible that the tide is turning on these things. And of course, there are arguments pro and con about many different aspects of immigration. We don't want to oversimplify the issue. What we did, I think, successfully in this document is we showed, using good data, using good projection methods, et cetera, that immigration makes a difference to population numbers in the United States. And those population numbers, in turn, make a difference in our ability to create a sustainable society.
Yes, and that's a very important finding, I believe. And again, it's one that needs to be communicated to the public. This is an issue that isn't going away, and sticking our heads in the sand doesn't mean that the impacts will disappear.
Leon Kalankowicz, thank you so much for being with us today on The Population Factor.
Bill, it was a real pleasure. Thank you.
See you again soon.
Okay.